January 1951. Busan Perimeter, South Korea. Captain Robert Gaines has a problem. He's a quartermaster officer responsible for managing supplies for the 2nd Infantry Division. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. Everything an army needs to function. He's good at his job. The division is well supplied. They have enough of everything. But 10 miles from his supply depot, there's a refugee camp with 10,000 Korean civilians, and they're starving. The camp has no official food supply. The UN relief agencies haven't reached this area yet. The Korean government is overwhelmed. These people are eating grass, tree bark, anything they can find. Children are dying of malnutrition at a rate of 5 to 10 per day. Gaines can see the camp from his depot. He watches people dying while he sits on warehouses full of food that belongs to the U.S. Army, food he's not authorized to distribute to civilians. So Captain Robert Gaines makes a decision. He's going to steal from his own army, and he's going to feed those 10,000 people. Here's the regulation. Army supplies are for army use only, period. You don't give them to civilians, even starving civilians, without proper authorization. Authorization comes from higher headquarters, usually division level or above, and it requires paperwork. Requisition forms, justification, approval signatures, documentation. The process takes weeks. Gaines knows that by the time authorization comes through, if it comes through at all, hundreds of those refugees will be dead. So he decides to skip the paperwork. He's going to divert supplies directly to the refugee camp, and he's going to cook the books to hide it. It's theft, it's fraud, it's court-martial offense. And Gaines doesn't care, because he's a quartermaster. His job is logistics, making sure people have what they need to survive. And right now, 10,000 people need food more than the army needs an extra month's worth of reserve rations. Here's how he does it. The army supply system in Korea is chaos in early 1951. The Chinese intervention has disrupted everything. Units are retreating, reforming, moving constantly. Supply requisitions don't always match consumption. There's waste, confusion, errors in accounting. Gaines exploits this chaos. He starts by overordering. His division needs 50,000 rations per month. He requisitions 60,000. The extra 10,000 go to the refugee camp. He justifies the overorder by claiming higher than expected wastage. Rations damaged in transport, spoiled by weather, lost during the retreat. It's all plausible in the chaos of winter 1951. Then he manipulates the inventory reports. When supplies arrive, he records some of them as damaged or unsalvageable. Those damaged supplies get trucked to the refugee camp at night. His men are in on it. They know what he's doing. Some of them object. Say it's illegal, that Gaines will get court-martialed. Gaines tells them, "If you want to report me, go ahead, but I'm feeding those people. If the army wants to punish me for that, fine." Most of his men agree to help. A few refuse but don't report him. They understand why he's doing it even if they won't participate. The operation runs for 3 months, January through March 1951. During that time, Gaines diverts approximately 180,000 rations to the refugee camp, enough to feed 10,000 people at subsistence level. The death rate in the camp drops from 200 per month to about 30 per month. Those 170 lives saved per month add up. Over 3 months, Gaines prevents an estimated 500 deaths, but he's also creating a paper trail. Every falsified inventory report, every fake damage claim, every overorder. It's all documented, and eventually someone at division headquarters notices the pattern. In March 1951, the division quartermaster, a lieutenant colonel, reviews the supply reports. He sees that Gaines' depot has unusually high wastage rates, much higher than other depots. He initiates an investigation, sends an inspector to audit Gaines' records. The inspector arrives in early April, spends 3 days reviewing paperwork, checking inventory, interviewing Gaines' men, and he figures it out. The numbers don't add up. The damaged supplies aren't in the disposal records. The overorders don't match the consumption rates. Gaines is diverting supplies somewhere. The inspector confronts Gaines. "Captain, your records show 180,000 rations listed as damaged or lost, but there's no documentation of disposal. Where did those rations go?" Gaines knows he's caught. He could lie, try to cover it up, but he's too tired and honestly too proud of what he's done. He tells the inspector the truth. "I gave them to the refugee camp 10 miles from here. Those people were starving. I had food. I fed them." The inspector is stunned. "You understand that's theft of government property?" Gaines nods. "Yes, sir, I understand, but those people aren't dead. That matters more to me than regulations." The inspector files his report. Recommends court-martial proceedings. By May 1951, Gaines is formally charged: theft of government property, falsification of official records, fraud. The charges are serious. Maximum penalty, dishonorable discharge, and 10 years in military prison. The case goes up the chain. Division commander reviews it. He's in a difficult position. On one hand, Gaines clearly violated regulations. Can't let officers just steal supplies whenever they want. On the other hand, Gaines saved lives. Prevented a humanitarian disaster. And the publicity would be terrible. Court-martial an officer for feeding starving refugees. How does that look? The division commander makes a decision. He's going to handle it administratively rather than through court-martial. Gaines will be relieved of his duties, given a letter of reprimand, and reassigned to a non-supply position. It's punishment but not career-ending, and it avoids the publicity of a trial. Gaines accepts the punishment, doesn't fight it. He's reassigned to an administrative job at division headquarters. Pushes paper for the rest of his tour. But word gets out. Other officers hear about what Gaines did, and reactions are mixed. Some think he's a hero, put humanity before bureaucracy, did what was right even knowing the consequences. Others think he's a problem, set a dangerous precedent. Can't have officers deciding which rules apply to them. Both positions are valid, because Gaines did violate regulations, and regulations exist for good reasons. You can't have an army if everyone just does what they think is right regardless of orders. But Gaines also saved 500 lives. And isn't that what armies are supposed to do? Protect people. The tension between those two positions never really resolves, but here's what happens next. In June 1951, a journalist hears about the case, writes a story for Stars and Stripes. Army captain punished for feeding refugees. The story gets picked up by American newspapers. And suddenly, Gaines is famous. Public reaction is overwhelmingly supportive. Letters pour into the Pentagon. Veterans groups, churches, civic organizations, all saying the same thing: how dare you punish a man for feeding starving children? The army is embarrassed. They try to spin it. Say Gaines wasn't punished for feeding refugees, he was punished for violating supply regulations. The public doesn't buy it. They see it clearly. Gaines fed starving people. The army punished him. That's wrong. Congressional pressure starts building. Several congressmen write to the army demanding Gaines' record be cleared. The army resists initially, but by August 1951, they cave. They remove the letter of reprimand from Gaines' file. They transfer him back to a quartermaster position, not in Korea but in Japan. And they issue a policy clarification. Officers are authorized to provide humanitarian assistance to civilians in extreme circumstances, with proper documentation to follow. It's basically legalizing what Gaines did, but after the fact. Gaines finishes his tour in Japan, returns to the States in 1952, and here's where the story gets interesting, because Gaines doesn't leave the army. He stays in, makes it a career, rises to lieutenant colonel, serves in Vietnam, retires in 1968 after 22 years of service, and throughout his career he's known as the guy who stole food for refugees. Some officers hold it against him, think he got away with insubordination, but most respect him. See him as someone who understood that rules serve people, not the other way around. In 1975, Gaines is contacted by a Korean immigrant in California. The man says he was in that refugee camp in 1951. He was 7 years old. He remembers American soldiers bringing food. He remembers not being hungry anymore, he says. I probably would have died without that food. I wanted to find whoever was responsible and say thank you. Gaines meets with the man. They talk for hours. The man tells him what happened to the refugees after the food started arriving, how the death rate dropped, how people had hope again, how children started playing instead of just lying there starving. The man says he came to America in 1965, got an education, became an engineer, has a family, and none of that would have happened if he died in that camp. Gaines is moved. He'd never really thought about the individual lives he'd saved, just the numbers. 500 deaths prevented, but hearing this man's story, understanding that one of those 500 went on to live a full life, have children, contribute to society, that's when the weight of it hits him. That's 500 individual stories, 500 lives that continued, and all the children those people had, and the grandchildren, the ripple effects of keeping people alive. After that meeting, Gaines starts seeking out other refugees from that camp. He finds about 20 who'd immigrated to the United States, meets with them, hears their stories, and he realizes the court-martial risk was worth it. Even if he'd been convicted, even if he'd gone to prison, it would have been worth it to save these lives. In 1985, the Korean-American community in Los Angeles organizes a tribute dinner for Gaines. They invite all the former refugees they can find who were in that camp. About 60 people attend. They present Gaines with a plaque. It says, "To Captain Robert Gaines, who chose humanity over regulations, you saved our lives. We and our children and our grandchildren are grateful." Gaines, in his acceptance speech, says something that becomes his legacy. He says, "I was a quartermaster. My job was logistics, making sure people had what they needed. In January 1951, 10,000 people needed food. I had food. The regulations said I couldn't give it to them. I decided the regulations were wrong. I don't regret that. I'd do it again." That quote gets repeated in military ethics courses because it captures the fundamental tension in military service. When do you follow orders? When do you use your own judgment? When is disobedience the right choice? There's no clear answer. It depends on circumstances, on stakes, on values. But Gaines' case provides a useful example. Sometimes the stakes are life and death. And when the stakes are that high, humanity should win over bureaucracy. Now let me tell you about the policy changes that came from this. After Gaines' case, the Army revised its humanitarian assistance guidelines. They created a category called Immediate Humanitarian Response. It allows commanders in the field to provide emergency assistance to civilians without prior approval, food, medical care, shelter, as long as it's documented afterward. That policy exists today. When American troops encounter humanitarian crises, they can respond immediately. They don't need to wait for authorization. They act first, do the paperwork later. That's a direct result of Gaines showing that waiting for authorization costs lives. The policy has been used hundreds of times. In Iraq, Afghanistan, disaster response operations, American troops provide food, water, medical care to civilians in crisis, and they do it under the authority that Gaines' case created. That's institutional change from individual action. Gaines broke the rules, got punished, but ultimately forced the institution to change the rules to match what he'd proven was necessary. Here's the broader lesson. Institutions create rules to manage complexity. The Army needs supply regulations so resources are used efficiently, but rules are imperfect. They can't account for every situation. Sometimes circumstances arise where following the rules produces immoral outcomes. That's when individuals have to make judgment calls. Do you follow the rule even though it causes harm? Or do you break the rule because circumstances demand it? There's risk either way. If you follow the rule and people die, you've prioritized process over people. If you break the rule and get caught, you face punishment. Gaines chose to break the rule. He calculated that 500 lives were worth his career. That's a hard choice. Most people wouldn't make it, but Gaines did. And he was proven right, not in the sense that he avoided punishment. He didn't. He was relieved of duty and reprimanded, but in the sense that his action forced the institution to acknowledge the rule was inadequate. And they changed it. That's moral courage. Not just doing what you think is right, but being willing to accept the consequences of doing right. Gaines knew he'd be caught. He knew he'd be punished. He did it anyway, Because the alternative, watching 10,000 people starve while sitting on food, was unacceptable to him. Now, some people will say, but what if every quartermaster just decided which rules to follow? What if supply officers all over Korea started giving away supplies whenever they felt like it? Wouldn't that create chaos? Fair point. Which is why Gaines' case is instructive. He didn't just arbitrarily decide to ignore rules. He faced an extreme situation, immediate threat to life, no time for proper authorization, limited alternatives. In that context, his decision was justifiable, but the same decision in a different context might not be. That's why judgment matters. That's why we need thinking soldiers, not just order-following automatons. Because sometimes the situation demands deviation from standard procedure, and you need people who can recognize those situations and act appropriately. Robert Gaines died in 1998. His obituary mentioned his military service, his career in logistics. It didn't mention the 10,000 refugees, but at his funeral, 23 Korean Americans attended, former refugees and their children. They told Gaines' family what he'd meant to them, about the food that arrived in winter 1951, about the lives saved, about the families that exist because one captain decided regulations didn't matter as much as hungry children. Gaines' son was surprised. He'd known his father served in Korea. He didn't know about this story. He asked the refugees, "Why didn't my dad ever talk about this?" One of them said, "Because to him it wasn't heroic, it was obvious. People were starving, he had food, he fed them, that's what any decent person would do. He didn't think it was special." But it was special. Because most people don't risk their careers for strangers. Most people follow the rules even when the rules produce immoral outcomes. Most people prioritize their own security over others' survival. Gaines didn't. He risked everything for people he'd never met and would never see again. That's character. That's moral courage. That's leadership. Here's what I want you to remember. Captain Robert Gaines stole 180,000 rations from the U.S. Army. He falsified documents. He violated regulations. He got caught and punished. He also saved 500 lives. Those 500 people went on to have children and grandchildren. Today, there are probably 2,000 to 3,000 people alive because Gaines decided regulations didn't matter as much as starving refugees. That's his legacy. Not the letter of reprimand, not the relief from duty, not the punishment. The 2,000 to 3,000 people who exist because one quartermaster understood that logistics serves life, not the other way around. Remember his name. Remember what he did. And remember that sometimes the right thing to do is break the rules. When the stakes are high enough. When lives hang in the balance. When following orders means watching people die. That's when you have to decide. Am I going to be a good soldier who follows regulations? Or am I going to be a good person who saves lives? Gaines chose to be a good person. The Army punished him for it. Then they changed their regulations to make his actions legal. Because even institutions eventually recognize moral truth, even if it takes a court-martial threat and congressional pressure to get there. So here's my question to you. If you were in Gaines' position, what would you do? Would you follow the regulations and watch 10,000 people starve? Or would you break the rules and risk your career? There's no easy answer, but your answer tells you something about who you are, and maybe who you want to be. Captain Robert Gaines knew who he was. He was a quartermaster who understood that his job was keeping people alive. All people, not just American soldiers, people.